I'm Amanda, 27, and I just got married a few months ago. But getting there was an absolute mess thanks to my family. See, right before my wedding, my sister got caught cheating on her husband, Dan. She'd been acting strangely for a while, and when Dan finally checked her phone, he found out she'd been involved with one of his friends. It was messy. Dan packed up, moved out, and filed for divorce, all within a week of discovering what she'd done. By the time everything came to light, there was only a week left until my wedding. Ideally, my sister's issues wouldn't have affected my wedding plans. She and I were never particularly close, so I didn't see any reason for her drama to overshadow my big day. But apparently my parents had other ideas. They asked me to postpone my wedding, not just for a few weeks or months, but for an entire year. They said it would be too hard on my sister to go through her divorce while attending my wedding. According to them, it would be insensitive of me to go ahead with my plans. I was stunned. How could they seriously think that postponing my wedding for a year, after all the planning, payments, and preparations, was even an option? And to do it all for my sister who'd brought this upon herself. It wasn't just that she'd cheated either. From what I knew, she'd been exchanging some pretty incriminating messages with Dan's friend, and they'd even planned a few meetups. She hadn't gone through with them, but to me, the intent alone was bad enough. I didn't feel any sympathy for her. If anything, I thought Dan was doing the right thing by moving on, but my parents weren't convinced. They insisted my sister was innocent, claiming her messages were harmless flirting and nothing serious. They genuinely believed everyone flirts now and then, like it wasn't a big deal at all. It didn't matter that she'd gone behind her husband's back or that Dan had concrete proof. Somehow, in their eyes, she was still blameless. When I told my parents there was no way I was pushing back my wedding, they doubled down. They said they wouldn't come if I went ahead with it. Honestly, that didn't change my mind at all. I wasn't close to my family to begin with, and they'd never treated me like they treated my sister. So I told them plainly that it was fine if they didn't want to attend. They'd been invited as a courtesy, but I wasn't going to let them ruin something I'd been planning and looking forward to, just because they felt my sister needed the extra support. My parents' reaction was nothing short of bizarre. When they realized I was serious about going ahead without them, they didn't try to apologize or change their minds. Instead, they started saying I'd been dishonest by not telling them who my in-laws really were. For context, my husband Ryan comes from a wealthy family. His family owns a successful pharmaceutical company, and most of his relatives work there, including him. I'd kept this information from my parents intentionally because, frankly, I didn't want them to know. Growing up, my parents always acted weird around anyone who had even a bit of money. They'd brown nose and act overly friendly, hoping these people would somehow invest in their hardware store, which had been struggling for as long as I could remember. The whole thing was uncomfortable and, honestly, embarrassing. I'd seen them act like this around some of our distant relatives and friends who were a little better off, and it was mortifying. My sister was no better. She'd join in, fawning over anyone with money in the hopes of getting something out of it. The last thing I wanted was for them to act this way around Ryan and his family, so I made sure to downplay everything about his family's business when they met him. Ryan played along, always presenting himself as just an employee, and my parents treated him normally. Since my family doesn't take much interest in my life, they only met Ryan's family once, when we got engaged, and even then, everyone on Ryan's side kept things low-key. But all that went out the window once my parents discovered the truth. At our wedding, Ryan's family posted a few photos to social media, and one of his relatives shared them on the company's official page. My parents, who are always online, saw the photos and quickly figured out who Ryan's family really was. I barely had time to enjoy my honeymoon phase before they were bombarding me with texts and calls. They were furious, claiming I had lied to them and cheated them out of an opportunity to network with my in-laws. They accused me of leading them to believe Ryan's family was normal, and said that if they'd known the truth, they would have tried to attend and get closer to his family. They even claimed I'd robbed them of valuable business opportunities by hiding my husband's family background. In their minds, if Ryan's family posted about the wedding on the company page, it had to mean they were important figures in the company. I didn't respond to them at first, wanting to enjoy the first days of my married life in peace. But 2 days ago, my parents showed up at our house unannounced, demanding to know why I'd hidden the truth. They were livid, saying I'd deceived them and broken their trust. Ryan and I invited them in out of politeness, but we both made it clear that we didn't owe them an explanation, nor would I be apologizing for anything. That only seemed to make them angrier. At that point, my mum started getting emotional, even crying. She brought up things from the past, saying they'd raised me, supported me, and that this was how I repaid them. They insisted they had always tried to be good parents, and they were hurt that I hadn't given them a chance to connect with my in-laws. Hearing them twist the story was too much. As far as I could remember, they'd always favored my sister and only did the bare minimum for me. I tried to ignore their accusations, but it was impossible. They kept claiming that I'd purposely shut them out of an opportunity to become closer to a wealthy family, and my mum even said that I was clearly ashamed of them. According to them, the fact that I hadn't had a big public engagement or a large wedding was proof that I didn't want anyone to know they were my family. At that point, I'd had enough. I told them that it wasn't their financial status that embarrassed me, but rather their behavior. It was the way they acted around anyone with money, the way they'd brown nose and make everyone uncomfortable. But they wouldn't listen. They just doubled down, saying that my embarrassment over them was a good enough reason for them to feel betrayed. By then, their self-pity and accusations had pushed me to my limit. I finally told them to leave. I'd invited them in with the hope of a civil conversation, but it was clear that was never going to happen. Before they left, my mum turned back, tears streaming down her face, and accused me of thinking I was too good for my family. She said they regretted not attending my wedding and regretted ever trying to reach out. It was clear they felt entitled to more than they'd ever given me. And their sense of betrayal was only because I hadn't let them exploit my new family. Now, here I am, wondering if I was wrong to hide the truth from them. Am I the jerk for not letting my parents know who my in-laws are, or did I have the right to protect myself and my relationship from their uncomfortable behavior? For the first few days after that blow-up, I was honestly too exhausted to deal with my parents. I thought they'd finally gotten the message and would leave me alone, but they were relentless. I kept getting messages from them, laced with guilt trips about how I'd betrayed them and made them look like fools. They told me over and over that I was acting like they weren't good enough for me. But here's the thing, this whole betrayal wasn't even about family bonds or love. It was about the fact that they'd missed out on meeting and impressing my in-laws. I could practically hear their regret in the messages they sent, lamenting how they lost an opportunity because I hadn't been upfront about Ryan's family. It wasn't my relationship with them they were mourning. It was the chance they'd missed to make business connections and possibly get some financial boost for their own struggling store. I still hadn't responded to their calls or texts, and things seemed to be calming down until they showed up at my door again. This time they weren't so angry as they were acting defeated and hurt. They sat on our couch, sighing and giving me these sad looks, hoping, I guess, that it would wear me down. My mum went back to her emotional play, saying she didn't know how I could keep something so important from them. When I pointed out that my personal life, especially details that didn't impact them, was none of their business, they wouldn't accept it. They kept repeating that they had a right to know everything about my life. They even insisted that as my parents, they should be part of every major decision, including who I marry and what kind of family I marry into. Ryan sat there listening quietly, trying to keep calm, but he eventually spoke up. He said, "Amanda and I chose to keep things private because we knew how uncomfortable it would make everyone. We didn't want anyone feeling awkward or judged." My parents took it as a personal insult. My mum shook her head, saying, "So you think we're not good enough for you? That's what this is all about, right?" I didn't hold back this time. I told them that it wasn't about not being good enough, but about their habit of treating people with money like walking opportunities. I reminded them of how they'd acted around other family members who had even a little bit more than we did. always fawning over them and making things uncomfortable for everyone involved. I told them I didn't want my in-laws to feel that kind of pressure from people who were supposed to be family. But that only seemed to fan the flames. They fired back, saying that I had no right to make such assumptions about them. According to them, they would have treated my in-laws with respect, not like business opportunities. I knew better. I'd seen them act this way too many times to believe they'd behave differently with my in-laws. At that point, they changed tactics, bringing up my sister and her divorce. They claimed they'd missed my wedding because they were supporting her, and that I didn't appreciate how hard things were for her. They went on and on about how my sister had been going through so much and how I'd gone ahead with my wedding without a second thought. My frustration finally reached a boiling point. I told them it was absurd to expect me to put my life on hold for my sister's mistakes. She cheated on her husband. You're calling her innocent. But she brought this on herself. They tried to counter with the same old line about her innocent flirting, but I didn't let them get away with it. I made it clear that I didn't owe anyone anything just because they were going through a hard time, especially when that hard time was entirely self-inflicted. After a long, tense silence, my mum started tearing up again, saying, "We just wanted the family to be there for each other, but I guess we're just not that important to you anymore." I could tell she was hoping to guilt me into changing my mind, but it only made me feel even more certain that I was doing the right thing by setting boundaries. That was the end of the conversation that day, or so I thought. But 2 days later, they showed up unannounced at my in-laws' house. Somehow, they'd figured out where Ryan's parents lived and had decided to bring their complaints directly to them. They didn't even bother to call or give any kind of warning. They just showed up on my in-laws' doorstep, acting as though they had every right to be there. I found out about it later when my mother-in-law called me, sounding understandably uncomfortable. She told me my parents had shown up and wanted to have a chat about me and Ryan. I couldn't believe it. Not only had they ignored every boundary I'd set, but they were now dragging my in-laws into their drama, thinking they could get sympathy or somehow convince Ryan's family that I was in the wrong. Ryan and I rushed over, hoping to smooth things over. When we arrived, my parents were sitting comfortably in my in-laws' living room, acting like they were part of the family. They'd already started talking about how difficult I'd been lately and how they felt I was trying to distance myself from them. My father-in-law looked awkward, smiling politely, clearly unsure of how to handle this uninvited family therapy session. Trying to stay calm, I told my parents they had no right to show up at my in-laws' home without permission. I reminded them that this issue was between us and that dragging Ryan's family into it was completely inappropriate. My dad brushed it off, saying, "We knew you'd come if we showed up here. We had no other choice." I knew that was true. They'd picked Ryan's parents' house on purpose, knowing we'd rush over to handle the situation. But it didn't make it any better. I told them firmly that showing up at my in-laws' place uninvited was crossing a line and that they needed to respect our space and our boundaries. Then they turned to my in-laws and started going on about how they were good parents, who had always tried to do their best, and how they were hurt and confused by the way I was treating them. They tried to paint me as this ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned her family. My parents actually told my in-laws that they hoped Ryan's family would be better influences on me, as if I was some rebellious teenager needing to be set straight. Thankfully, my in-laws were quick to see through the manipulation. My mother-in-law calmly explained that Ryan and I were adults who had the right to set boundaries, and that if we wanted some space, it was our decision. She made it clear that they supported me and that they wouldn't tolerate any attempts to guilt-trip us. My parents didn't know how to respond. It was obvious they hadn't expected Ryan's family to defend me. After an awkward silence, my parents finally decided it was time to leave. They mumbled something under their breath as they walked out, but I didn't care to hear it. I was just relieved they were finally gone. After they left, I apologized to my in-laws, embarrassed by the whole thing. They assured me they weren't bothered and said they fully understood why I'd kept my family at a distance. We spent the rest of the evening talking, and they reassured me that they respected my decision and would support me however they could. Since that night, I felt a mix of anger and sadness. I can't believe my parents would go so far as to show up at my in-laws' house just to make me look like the bad guy. But at the same time, I feel like this is exactly why I've kept my distance for so long. They've always made everything about them, and they don't care how uncomfortable they make everyone else in the process. Right now, I'm at a point where I'm wondering if I should just cut them out entirely. I want peace in my life, and I can't keep dealing with their constant guilt trips and drama. I don't know if I'll ever get through to them, but I do know I need to prioritize my happiness and my new family. After that disaster at my in-laws' place, I figured my parents might finally back off, realizing that their tactics weren't going to work. For a few days, things were quiet. I didn't get any more surprise visits or passive-aggressive texts, and for a moment, I thought maybe they'd accepted that I was serious about setting boundaries. But that peace didn't last. Soon enough, my sister Lisa got involved. She started calling me, and when I didn't answer, she sent long, ranting texts. Apparently, my parents had turned to her after my in-laws refused to entertain their drama. Lisa was now their new spokesperson, and she was furious. According to her messages, I was being selfish and heartless, breaking up the family just because I wanted to feel better than everyone else. In her texts, Lisa made it sound like I'd intentionally hurt our parents by not including them fully in my new life. She said they were devastated and that I'd humiliated them in front of my in-laws. She seemed completely blind to the fact that it was our parents who had pushed things to this point. They had chosen to miss my wedding, chosen to show up uninvited at my in-laws' home, and were now trying to manipulate everyone into thinking I was the villain. I tried explaining this, saying that if they felt embarrassed, it was a consequence of their own actions, not anything I'd done. But Lisa wouldn't hear it. She also threw in some guilt about her recent divorce, saying that I was making things worse for everyone by refusing to support her during this difficult time. I reminded her as calmly as I could that her situation was the result of her own decisions. She'd cheated on her husband, and expecting everyone to revolve their lives around her pain was unreasonable. When I pointed this out, she flew off the handle, accusing me of being callous and cruel for not showing more empathy. Her anger reached a new level when I brought up accountability. I told her that our family seemed to have a major issue with taking responsibility for their actions, and I wasn't going to keep bending over backward to appease everyone. I said, "Just because I'm family doesn't mean I'm obligated to absorb everyone's consequences." That struck a nerve. Lisa sent back a flurry of angry messages, cursing at me and calling me every name in the book. It was clear she wasn't open to seeing things from my perspective, so I decided it was time to cut her off too. I blocked her number, feeling both relief and sadness. As dysfunctional as things were, these people were still my family, and choosing to block them felt heavy. But I knew I needed to protect my own peace. The silence that followed was a much-needed break. I finally had some time to focus on my life with Ryan without any interference or drama. For the first time since the wedding, I felt like I could actually breathe. Ryan was incredibly supportive throughout all of this, reminding me that setting boundaries didn't make me a bad person. He helped me see that it was okay to prioritize my well-being and that I didn't owe anyone an apology for doing so. But of course, it didn't take long for my parents to come back into the picture. A few weeks later, they found out through a mutual family member that Ryan and I were planning to move into a new house, a wedding gift from his parents. They hadn't known about it before because we hadn't shared the address with anyone outside of our close circle. The new house was a fresh start for us, somewhere my parents couldn't just show up uninvited, and we were careful to keep the location private. But somehow, they managed to get the details. That's when things escalated again. My parents saw the move as me cutting ties and abandoning them entirely. They contacted me through a new number since I'd blocked their old one. I considered blocking them again, but this time they took a different approach. They started out calmly, almost like they were testing a new tactic. My mum sent a long message saying they were worried about me and that I seemed to be going down a dark path of selfishness and disrespect. She said I was closing off and that family should always come first, no matter what. It was manipulative, of course, but the wording was softer this time. It made me feel a little guilty, even though I knew that was exactly what they wanted. Still, I didn't respond. I was learning that every time I let them in, they only used it as an opportunity to pull me back into their cycle of control. Then, they tried something new, reaching out to Ryan directly. They called him, asking him to talk some sense into me. They painted themselves as the victims, saying they couldn't understand why I was being so harsh and distant. Ryan listened politely but didn't engage, simply telling them that he supported my decisions. He told them he wasn't going to interfere in my relationship with them, but he stood by my choice to set boundaries. When Ryan told me about the call, I felt a mix of anger and gratitude. It was infuriating that they'd tried to drag him into the mess, but I was so thankful that he'd handled it the way he did. He reassured me that this was my life, my choices, and that he wasn't going to let anyone change his view of me or pressure me to break my boundaries. With no way to reach me and no leverage left, my parents finally seemed to let go, or so I thought. Just when I began to think things were truly over, Lisa reached out to some of my in-laws directly. She sent them messages, trying to win them over by sharing her side of the story, which was essentially the same sob story she'd been using all along, that I was tearing the family apart, that I was abandoning everyone who cared about me, and that my parents were heartbroken. My in-laws saw right through it. They sent us screenshots, letting us know they'd been contacted but assuring us that they weren't taking her words seriously. It was comforting to see how loyal and supportive Ryan's family was, and it reassured me that I'd made the right choice by not involving my family in every aspect of my life. Ryan and I eventually made the move to our new house, and we've been settling in ever since. We've kept the address private, sharing it only with our closest friends and family members who've respected our boundaries. And for the first time, I feel a real sense of control over my life. Since moving, I haven't heard from my parents or Lisa. It's been a relief, but I also know that they're likely plotting their next move, waiting for an opportunity to reach out again. I wish I could say I believe they've finally accepted my choices, but deep down, I know them too well. They'll try again, likely when they think the timing is right, and they can catch me off guard. For now, though, I'm enjoying the peace. Ryan and I are focused on building our life together, free from the chaos and manipulation that used to be a constant part of my life. I'm learning that family doesn't have to mean sacrifice, guilt, or endless obligation. It can mean support, respect, and mutual understanding. And if my parents or sister can't understand that, then I'm finally okay with letting them go. Months passed quietly after the move, and for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of control. Ryan and I built our own routines, filled our new home with memories, and enjoyed the calm that came with our fresh start. The silence from my parents and Lisa was refreshing, like a weight had finally lifted. For a while, it felt like things were finally settling down. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from my mother-in-law. She sounded concerned, asking if Ryan and I could come over as soon as possible. Apparently, my parents had shown up at her house, completely uninvited, once again. This time, they weren't just there to talk. They were there with a mission. They wanted to resolve things with me, and they had decided that the best place to do it was at my in-laws' home. Ryan and I immediately drove over, dreading whatever scene they might have created. When we arrived, there they were, sitting comfortably in my in-laws' living room, acting like they had every right to be there. They'd made themselves at home, chatting up my father-in-law and casually trying to make it seem like they were the loving, concerned parents they always pretended to be. My in-laws, ever polite and gracious, were handling it as best they could, but I could tell they were uncomfortable. The second we walked in, my mom jumped up, a forced smile plastered on her face. "Amanda, we've been waiting to talk to you. We just want to set things right," she said, reaching out like this was a big family reunion. I kept my distance, crossing my arms and looking directly at her. "This isn't the place for this conversation, Mom. You had no right to show up here unannounced. Her face fell, the fake smile disappearing. My dad jumped in, trying to smooth things over. "We came because we needed to talk to you and knew you wouldn't come if we asked. So we thought maybe if we all sat down together as a family, we could work things out." I couldn't believe their nerve. They'd ignored my boundaries, humiliated themselves and me, and now they were dragging my in-laws into their mess once again. I turned to my parents and said as calmly as I could, "If I wanted to talk to you, I would have. You didn't need to drag my in-laws into this. This is not their problem." That's when they switched tactics. They turned to my in-laws, trying to make me look like the unreasonable one. "Do you see what we have to deal with?" my mum said, voice trembling in a classic performance. "We've tried everything to get through to her, but she's become so distant, so hard-hearted. My mother-in-law, bless her, kept her composure and said firmly, "Amanda and Ryan are adults. They've set boundaries and we respect that. We would appreciate it if you could respect that too." I could see my parents' shock. They hadn't expected my in-laws to back me up so decisively, but they didn't give up. They kept trying to spin the story in their favour, talking about how they were only doing what's best for the family, and how heartbroken they were that I'd cut them off. I listened for a few minutes, mostly out of respect for my in-laws, who were clearly uncomfortable but handling it gracefully. Then my dad pulled the last card he had. He turned to me and said, "We just don't understand why you're so ashamed of us. We did everything for you, raised you the best we could, and this is how you repay us, by shutting us out." That hit a nerve. All the resentment and frustration I'd held in for so long came rushing up. I looked at them both and said, "I'm not ashamed of where I came from. I'm ashamed of how you act around people with money, like they're nothing more than stepping stones to something better for yourselves. I didn't hide Ryan's family from you because I'm ashamed of you. I hid them because I knew exactly how you'd treat them. You'd see them as an opportunity, not as people. My mum started to speak, but I held up a hand. "And the fact that you're here right now, showing up, uninvited, and dragging my in-laws into this, just proves it. You're not here because you care about me. You're here because you're desperate to get back in my life now that you know the kind of family I married into. I'm not a bridge to your next business deal, and I refuse to be treated like one. My parents were speechless. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. Finally, my father-in-law cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I think Amanda and Ryan have made their position very clear. We all value family, but only when that relationship is based on respect. I think it's best for everyone if we end this conversation here." That was it. My parents knew they'd lost. They mumbled a hasty goodbye and shuffled out, not even looking back as they left. I let out a long breath, feeling a strange combination of sadness and relief. It was the end of a chapter I'd been holding on to for way too long. My in-laws gave me a reassuring hug, and Ryan put his arm around me as we left their house. After that encounter, I didn't hear from my parents for weeks. It was like they'd finally understood that no amount of guilt-tripping or boundary breaking was going to change things. I thought I was free of it all until, one morning, I received a message from an unknown number. It was from my sister, Lisa. She'd heard about what happened at my in-laws' place and was furious. She accused me of humiliating our parents, saying I'd disrespected them in front of people who aren't even family. Her messages were filled with the same accusations as before: how I was being selfish, how I was tearing the family apart, how our parents were heartbroken. She even accused me of being heartless for not helping our parents out now that they were struggling financially after selling their store. I'd had enough. I didn't bother responding to her message. I blocked her number right then and there. I'd heard everything I needed to hear, and it was clear that nothing I said would change her mind. She'd always be on their side, and she'd never understand why I needed to cut them off. Over the next year, Ryan and I focused on our life together. We celebrated our first anniversary, and we started talking about expanding our family. We knew that starting a family would be a huge decision, especially with the potential for my parents to try and worm their way back into our lives once they heard the news. But we were prepared to handle it together. My in-laws were incredibly supportive, reminding me that family is what we make of it and that love and respect are the foundation of real family ties. Looking back, I feel both sadness and relief. Sadness, because a part of me wishes things could have been different, that my parents could have been genuinely happy for me, that they could have respected my choices. But I feel relief too, knowing that I finally stood up for myself and set boundaries that gave me the peace I'd been craving for so long. I don't know if my parents will ever change. They might eventually reach out, especially if Ryan and I start our own family. And I know they'll try to guilt me back into their lives. But this time, I'm ready. I have a new family now, one that's built on love and respect. And that's all I need. Story 2. It's unjust, according to my mum. She always picked her stepdaughter over me, even though she cannot see my child. Hello, everyone. Lisa here, 54, and my narrative centers on my mixed family. From my previous marriage with my ex-husband, John, Rachel, one of my daughters, is 27 now. Of course, we divorced when Rachel was 4 years old, but we maintained things fairly amicable between for a few years following the divorce. I ran upon Mark, my present spouse. Now 55, he entered the picture with 2 children from his former marriage. Andy, who is 25 now, and Sarah, Rachel's age exactly. The fact that Mark's children were so close in age to my daughter was the greatest thing. Rachel and Sarah would hit it off and be exactly like sisters, I thought. I was thrilled at the idea of mixing our families when Mark and I took things seriously. Actually, what could go wrong here? I assumed both girls would become quick best friends as they were soon to be adolescents. Rachel was usually on the more subdued, independent side. Sarah was more gregarious. Still, I reasoned they would counter one another. Though they both would roll their eyes at me when I mentioned it, I would even taunt them, calling them my twin daughters. Rachel didn't enjoy the moniker, but in my thoughts it was only light-hearted fun. Once Mark and I were married, we threw ourselves into making this blended family arrangement successful. Family meals, trips, visits, you name it, we did it. There was a period of adjustment, certainly, but it was much better than I had anticipated. Sarah spent a lot of time about the home. She was constantly chatting and yearning to hang with Rachel. The two of them seemed to be turning out just as I had wanted. Close friends able to rely on one another. From the kitchen I would watch them. Rachel was listening to Sarah ramble on and on about the newest rumours from the school, or which lads she found appealing. And I would find pride rising in my head. As a family, we were doing well. I'm not sure Rachel felt the same. She said not much about it, and I assumed she was following orders. She has always been quiet and more independent, not quite the feminine kind. This is why I felt it was fantastic she had Sarah who could help her come out of her shell. When both girls were college age, things truly began to seem normal. Rachel started initially, and not long afterward she began working part-time at a cafe close to her university. She appeared very delighted and would occasionally come home to tell us about work. One day she then mentioned Nick, this man. She had met him in the cafe, and perhaps by 3 or 4 years he was rather older than she was. Her comments about him made it really evident she was attracted to him. She had highlighted minor things he would say or do, and it was difficult to tell where this was headed. She invited Nick over to meet the family eventually. He was calm and kind, the type of man you would be at ease having around. Though at first odd, his somewhat older age appeared reasonable. He seemed mature and level-minded. He blended really nicely with us, and I could see Rachel was delighted to have him around. Not too long after, Nick was essentially living with our family. He would regularly settle down to watch a game with Mark or speak with me as I prepared, and he would join us for meals and events. He would discuss his future with Rachel, his work, and his plans. I have to say I found him appealing. For Rachel, who occasionally felt a little distant or nervous, he was courteous and exuded a calmness that seemed ideal. He delighted her, as I could see. And isn't everything a mother wishes for her daughter? Things were going so perfectly that I nearly overlooked any drawback. I supposed this to be it. We are all at last gathering together. And then the plan developed. Nick proposed to Rachel over a dinner party fronting the entire family, totally unexpectedly out of the blue. It was among those large romantic gestures. Of course, she also answered yes. That night was flawless. Looking around the entire family, I recall thinking, this is exactly what I always wanted. A whole, devoted family. Everyone was laughing and cheering. Mark was shining, patting Nick on the behind. But Sarah appeared quieter than normal when I looked at her. Given she lacked someone meaningful in her life at the time, unlike Rachel, I reasoned maybe she felt excluded, saying something like, "Don't worry, your time will come." I tried to somewhat uplift Sarah later that evening. Not really gave it any thought. She only nodded and grinned, saying she was glad Rachel would be happy. And with that was that. I went to bed expecting and feeling well. Rachel and Sarah would only get closer during the whole wedding, so I assumed. Like actual sisters organising wedding preparations, dress shopping, all that exciting activity, they would be there for each other. As it happens, though, things were not as flawless as they first appeared. Over the next weeks, Rachel began acting quite aloof. She still seemed attentive and eager, but she seemed less like Sarah. I wrote it off at first. Organising a wedding can be taxing, and I reasoned it was simply anxiety or jitters. But gradually I began to see the conflict in small details. Rachel showed up for family dinners, but she appeared quieter and less involved. In the same room, she was with Sarah. Their conversations and laughter lacked the usual resonance. Rachel would respond politely when I asked about the wedding, as if she didn't really want to talk about it. Again, I attributed it to stress, assuming she would have just visited once things calmed down. Sarah, however, continued to behave as though everything was good, trying to keep cheery and conversational. She would probe Rachel about wedding preparations, but Rachel would dismiss her, claiming she was still working things out. Looking back, I could see that Rachel could have been attempting to keep Sarah at arm's distance, but at the moment I gave it little thought. I reasoned it was simply normal sibling behaviour. One evening at supper was the turning point. Rachel had not visited in some time, so I welcomed Nick and her. From the time she entered, she seemed uptight and seldom made eye contact with Sarah. Nick joked about being stuck with the in-laws shortly at one point over dinner, and Rachel simply forcedly smiled. She just brushed it aside, claiming she was sleepy when I asked her if everything was well. I asked if Sarah and she had gone dress shopping together yet to try to lighten the situation. Rachel's face stiffened and she added, "I'll handle it on my own." They're stung. This wedding was supposed to be a moment for the two of them to become closer, to support one another. Rachel, though, seems to be rather committed to excluding everybody, even Sarah, only wanting to be of use. Looking back now, I knew that was most likely the start of something more, even if I had no idea what was going on under the surface. Funny how you may be so convinced everything is good and then discover how much you were lacking. At the moment, though, all I could see was Rachel pushing away the relatives who only wanted to help her. She was being aloof and cold. A few weeks following that supper, things only grew more strange. At this time, Rachel was essentially avoiding us, and I may have been a bit annoyed. Planning a wedding is, after all, demanding. Sure, but it's meant to be entertaining as well. Your family is meant to be your rock, not your escape route. I heard heavy knocking at the door one Saturday when home alone. Rachel was staring beyond wrath as I opened it. Her face was flushed, and she hardly even waved hello before hurrying into the home. She turned back to me after looking about, almost as if she was seeing whether anyone else was present. "Sarah is at where?" she asked, voice cutting and forceful. I didn't understand. "Sarah runs errands for your dad," I informed her. "Rachel, what is happening on?" She didn't respond, though. Rather, she began to pace, mumble under her breath about not believing it and treachery. I felt myself becoming nervous. Rachel's never been one to lose, after all. Like this. Cool. She brushed my hand off as I reached out, attempting to stop her from pacing. "Mum, do you know what Sarah has been doing behind my back?" she asked at last, almost spitting out every syllable. She was shivering and I could see her hands clenched. A lump developed in my throat. "Rachel, calm down kindly. You refer to what?" "Sarah has been sleeping next Nick," she remarked straightforwardly, staring me down as though she dared me to ignore it. "She has accompanied my fiancé, Mother. Your gorgeous little Sarah has been prowling about with him." I thought of myself as having been smacked. Totally astonished, I stood there trying to understand what she had said. Sarah and Nick together. It cannot be correct. Though I knew my daughters were different. Something this size just didn't make sense. Trying to keep my voice cool, Rachel said, "You sure?" Perhaps all you're doing is misreading things. She laughed, but that sounded not like happiness. Misinterpretation. Not at all. She reported to me personally. She hardly tried to refute it when I approached her. I still cannot quite believe it. It felt inconceivable, as Sarah would not have done something like this. Rachel had to be stretching her imagination. Alternatively, perhaps even turning what she had heard around. Nothing occurred to me when I attempted to consider anything Sarah could have said or done lately to suggest this. Rachel started looking for the appropriate vocabulary. Though I know you're angry, maybe this isn't what you believe it to be. Surely, perhaps it is simply a mistake. She glared fiercely, cutting me off. Mum, are you laughing at me? You are truly defending her. I found myself totally divided between the two of them. That Sarah, my lovely daughter, would turn on her like this astounds me. I couldn't, however, ignore Rachel's great hurt either. Her gaze at me with this mixture of disappointment and wrath was much different. It stings. Rachel, I am not standing up for anyone here. I attempted to clarify. I need to know. Perhaps Sarah and you could get down to discuss this. Our family is this. Rachel here. Families negotiate things. Fix stuff. She actually yelled. This is not only a little misinterpretation, Mum. She trailed behind my back with the man I was about to wed. She brought everything down. She drew away, fiercely crossing her arms over her chest as I tried to grab her hand. She was clearly trying to keep her cool, and I felt guilty about not supporting her right away. But in my perspective, Sarah was deserving of an opportunity to clarify. Not yet had we heard her side. Look, Rachel, I said slowly here. Though I understand your anger, perhaps there is a path forward from here. Sarah had to have had a reason. Individuals err. Her face turned as if she cannot believe what she was listening to. For a purpose. Mum, there's no justification for this being okay. I came here expecting you would really care, but all you are doing is protecting her. She shook her head as though I were a stranger. I ran, not sure what to say. I was powerless. Like all I mentioned would simply make things worse. I do worry, Rachel. Loving you both is great. I also want this not to split us apart. You already selected her, she continued, staring at me for a long time, then nearly whispering. And with that, she bolted from the home, leaving me staggered by her words behind. Feeling this terrible aching in my chest, I wondered whether she may be correct. Should I have selected Sarah? I had assumed I would be keeping the peace and attempting to be helpful. Rachel, though, appeared to believe I had betrayed her by not immediately denouncing Sarah. I sat down, attempting to sort through it all after she went. To help us decide what to do, I wanted to chat to Mark. Still, part of me felt afraid to bring it up. How was I meant to explain that my daughter, who I had always wanted to be close, was now essentially at war with each other? I wanted to keep things understated when Mark arrived home. Though I didn't go into great detail, I informed him Rachel was unhappy about something involving Sarah and Nick. He dismissed it, claiming Rachel will come to reason shortly. He reasoned she was only exaggerating and behaving theatrically. Sarah arrived home later that evening, and I couldn't see her the same way. Though I wanted to ask her what had happened to get her perspective, I hesitated. Hearing her confirm it that Rachel had been right all along, part of me was afraid. And what would I do then? I so avoided the encounter instead. If I left things alone, I reasoned perhaps everything would blow over and we could discuss this like adults in a few days. Maybe everyone would calm down. That did not, however, occur. Rachel instead ceased showing up completely. Days stretched into weeks, and every time I contacted her, she would either give me little, snipped responses or ignore my calls. Though I wanted to find out from Sarah exactly what was going on, I couldn't muster the will to prod her on it. I just couldn't bring myself to pry. Even though I saw her occasionally looking worriedly at me, part of me wanted to keep believing that Rachel had blown everything out of proportion. Maybe, just maybe, there had been some miscommunication. Deep down, though, I understood that if what Rachel said was accurate, this wouldn't simply fade away. I kept thinking Rachel would contact out and that we would be able to work this out after her furious leaving A's in a family. Not that I hadn't witnessed conflicts in my lifetime. Siblings contend that families have problems, but ultimately individuals come around. Families do just that, or that's what I believed anyhow. Rachel was ghostly the days after our conversation. Only quiet, no books, no calls. Every few days I had messaged her. Something basic like thinking about you or miss you. Call when it is most convenient. Not particularly deep. Simply an open invitation for her to return. But every time I wrote a note, it seemed as though I was sending it into a black hole. One evening, Mark entered the kitchen helping me to make dinner. I mentioned not hearing from Rachel. Assuming he could be suggesting we see her or even phone her. He waved it aside as though it were no great concern. She's most likely simply acting theatrically. Rachel has always been quite sensitive, he added. At his comments, I felt my stomach turn, but I stayed quiet. Mark's method has always in his mind been more hands-off. Eventually, everything work out. Why then should one stir the pot? Still, I felt Rachel needed us to get in touch. She was waiting for anything sort of indicating our caring. Still, part of me worried that pressing too hard might only cause her to feel more far off. I so kept my communications brief, expecting she would come around on her own at last. I even brought it up to Sarah, who seemed very offended to learn Rachel hadn't been in touch. Mum, when I attempted to apologise to her, Sarah remarked, her eyes slightly filling up. I assured her it was a mistake. I never wanted to hurt her. She doesn't give a damn, but she claimed she never wants to see me again. Hearing from Sarah hit me hard. Her expression showed clearly the hurt, and it dawned on me how convoluted this had become. Sarah was also in agony. Though I wanted to assist both of my daughters, I felt as though I was disappointing one of them no matter what I did. After that, things turned an even more unusual direction. Nick and Sarah, well, they began corking. Though it seems strange, the two of them seemed to click in this natural manner. Their relationship seemed to be supposed to be like this. Though I understood Rachel's perspective must have looked like. I'm not claiming it wasn't awkward initially. Nick had been involved with Rachel after all, and today he was courting her sister. But as I saw them interact, I could see they really loved one another. Together they seemed more content than I'd ever seen Nick and Rachel. To be honest, Nick and Sarah's situation didn't seem like it would work out. Yet somehow it did. They fit like two precisely matched puzzle pieces. Sarah brought out this friendliness in Nick, and he appeared to truly understand her, therefore providing the confidence she sometimes needed. They would finish each other's sentences, chuckle at one another's jokes, and whenever they looked at one another, their eyes would seem lighter. Rachel couldn't handle it, though. And I knew. She seemed somewhat angry the first she learned about Nick and Sarah being together. She had never shown me such anger before. She felt deceived, as though her sister had taken her happiness in addition to her fiancé. To her, that simply seemed like justification. I tried to explain that occasionally relationships change and that maybe things hadn't been intended to work out between her and Nick. I thus followed what any other mother would have done. Though only in little ways, I tried to bring them together. I advised Sarah to maybe send Rachel a letter apologizing for her. Perhaps I believed a sincere letter would change Rachel's position and enable her to see Sarah really regret everything. But Sarah shook her head, appearing demoralized. I have already tried, Mum. She's not listening. Though I hated feeling so powerless, I wasn't ready to quit up. I was expecting they would work it out if I simply tried hard enough. After all, grudges are not worth hanging on to in the brief time we live, and sisters were them, or as near sisters could be. I kept telling myself Rachel was wounded. Sometimes people need time to heal. Still, deep down I was becoming more annoyed. With Rachel quiet and Sarah's guilt hovering over the home, it wasn't only me experiencing the pressure either. Even family gatherings were strained. Andy would try to lighten the situation with jokes or arbitrary tales, but it seemed as though everyone was just going through the motions. I would first glance at Sarah, who hardly touched her food, then at Mark, who would essentially dismiss the circumstances like they would all blow over on their own. Thinking Rachel's dad, John, would be able to speak with her, I attempted getting in touch with him. Although we hadn't spoken much since the divorce, he was still her father and perhaps she would listen to him. I detailed what happened. Well, the bits I could still manage. Still, John shared my level of annoyance. Rachel had hardly been in touch with him to that. He added. She was not picking up his calls either. Lisa, he'd continued, sounding almost as powerless as I felt, and I'm not sure what you want me to do. Should she refuse to engage in conversation? She is not ready for conversation. I stayed up for so many nights repeatedly going over the final discussion I had with Rachel in my head, wondering whether there was anything I may have done better. Perhaps I ought to have immediately sided with her. Told her Sarah was mistaken while she was correct. Perhaps it would have been sufficient to convey my affection. What about Sarah, though? She would have felt as though I were hurrying her under the bus, and I couldn't treat her either. I started persuading myself Rachel simply needed more time. She would eventually cool off, return, and understand that we still loved her and that we wanted her to be in our life. A few weeks later, I made the decision to throw a modest family get-together. I thought it would be a nice justification for inviting Rachel around, give her cause to see us all and perhaps break the ice. I got in touch with her, let her know about the event, and then added, "It would mean a lot if you could make it." Not getting a reply, I continued checking my phone all evening in search of a last-minute text indicating she would be coming on the day of the gathering. Though she never showed, I continued staring at the entrance, hoping to see her pass. Sarah attempted to reassure me when she saw my dismay. "Maybe she simply needs more time, Mother. She'll drop by." Though her words seemed empty, I nodded and attempted a grin. Though Rachel's absence felt like a weight on my chest, I wanted to believe it. Every empty chair served as a reminder that something had gone quite wrong and left me wondering how I may correct it. I wrote Rachel one last, straightforward note following the conference. Though it went ignored, "We missed you today." Like every single mail I had sent prior. Days stretched into weeks, and the quiet between us got louder. Though part of me was beginning to worry that I was driving her more away with every try, I wanted to reach out one more. I started to doubt all I had done, wondering whether I should have handled it differently, whether perhaps by attempting to bring peace, I would have somehow made things worse. Then, one evening, while I was tidying the kitchen, Sarah entered and gave me a firm embrace. I asked her what was wrong out of nowhere, and she simply shook her head, saying, "I'm sorry, Mum, for everything." I gave her a back embrace, but I felt guilty even then. Here I was, consoling Sarah while Rachel was out there heartbroken and alone, not allowing any of us in. Though it seemed like the harder I tried, the worse things got, I wanted so desperately to be there for both of them to straighten this mess that seemed like it was separating our family. That night as I went to bed, I experienced a sinking sensation. Perhaps, just maybe, I had lost Rachel permanently. Rachel became silent for weeks, and at last, I realized maybe I simply needed to let her come around on her own. All the waiting and concern tired me. Maybe backing off would allow her the space she so obviously needed, and that she would finally come back to us when she was ready. Clearly, that was not what I wanted, but I had few choices and felt as though none of what I tried worked. One day then, out of the blue, an invitation showed up in the mailbox. Rachel's invitation to her wedding came first, let alone that she was planning a wedding. I recall standing in the kitchen, staring at it for a good minute, trying to grasp the idea that my own daughter hadn't even called to inform me she was engaged again. Opening the mail, I saw a basic card with the date, place, name of her and her fiancé, nothing more. No tiny note or personal remark, only the fundamental details. Saying it seemed impersonal would be to put it nicely. Still, I tried not to concentrate too much on it. She was inviting us at least. I thought perhaps this was her olive branch offering. The wedding was scheduled at a modest setting several hours away. Expecting Sarah to join in my enthusiasm, or at least astonishment, I recall delivering her the news over the phone. She quieted herself, albeit instead. She said little, simply something like "I suppose is reasonable." That was a somewhat strange answer. Though I knew things were still somewhat fresh for her, I wanted her to be as positive as I was. I reasoned it was okay. We were going to help Rachel, show up for her, and perhaps this would start the process of healing our family. We reserved a hotel close by, set everything up, and I even went shopping looking for the ideal attire. Rachel wanted to know I was there for her, that I cared. I was entirely preoccupied with how this may be a turning point, an opportunity for us to start over. But Mark arrived down with something a few days before the wedding. It was only a cold, maybe with a hint of the flu. It was nothing significant. Still, he wasn't looking great and he was curled up in bed. I took care of him all day, got him soup and all, but I was anxious the wedding was approaching quickly, and I didn't know whether he would be fit for the journey. I eventually phoned Rachel the evening before the wedding to let her know we might not make it. Though I was anxious about it, I reasoned she would know. Trying to keep my voice low, Rachel, honey, murmured, "We apologies. Unfortunately, your dad has been feeling very underactive lately. Tomorrow is the wedding, and I'm not sure whether we could make it, Dot." She spoke at last, and the other end stopped for a protracted silence. Her voice was icy. "You are not then showing up?" The strain started to build right away. "It's simply fair. Rachel, your dad is actually not doing great. You know, should we be able, we would be here. We even reserved everything, including a hotel. Seeing you made me really happy." She didn't reply for a time, then answered as like she was holding back mum, "You know what? Just ignore." Following that, she hung off with it as well. Heart pounding, I sat there with the phone trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Though I wanted to call her back, I was so startled and very honest, a bit wounded. Though I knew she was upset, I assumed she would understand that I couldn't exactly leave Mark alone while he was unwell. The remainder of the evening, I felt this odd combination of shame and annoyance. Rachel was overreacting, and I couldn't get rid of the impression that she was reading events too personally. Still, I also felt as though I could have disappointed her. I had no idea how to get out of this weird and agonizing environment. Instead of heading to Rachel's wedding the following day, I remained home with Mark. Part of me felt she would get in touch, maybe even let me know she understood me. But that never arrived. I convinced myself everything was okay. She simply needed time to cool off, and we would sort things out at last. Still, the next week was shockingly calm. Not from Rachel, not one word, not a call or a book. Neither. I continued looking for something, anything to prove she was prepared to sort things out. But nothing there was. Exactly silence. She seems to have closed off us totally. In the days after my beginning to hear from more relatives attending the wedding, they said Rachel looked lovely and that this was a small, personal event. Her dad, John, even reportedly led her down the aisle. Knowing we would have missed such a pivotal event stung, and I couldn't help but feel a bit left out, even though I wanted to be pleased for her. Like I had been cut out from in my own daughter's life. Sarah tried to reassure me when I brought it up with her. Rachel was only acting theatrically, she claimed, and she would have finally come around, but I could see she was merely trying to prevent me from being depressed. Deep down, I believe Sarah understood this was serious, that Rachel wouldn't forgive and forget so readily. Returning to my daily grind, I tried to seem as though everything was okay, but there was a hollow quality about everything. Each time I looked at my phone, I partly anticipated Rachel sending a message, a book claiming she missed us, anything to prove her continuing concern. But each day, I came upon nothing. Between us, the stillness was intolerable. Rachel would always want her family at her side, no matter what occurred, I had always imagined. I assumed she would contact people finally, that this only marked a phase. But it dawned on me as more time went on that perhaps this was hardly a phase at all. Perhaps she left this time truly gone. I would find myself questioning if I had made the correct decision or whether perhaps I should have just gone to the wedding without Mark. But that seemed improper as well. Mark was my spouse. He depended on me. I should not have to decide between my daughter and my spouse. Family was expected to pull together through illness and all else, right? Days stretched into weeks, and I came to see I might never have the opportunity to right things. Rachel was out there living her life. I was simply here waiting with nothing except solitude to keep company. Rachel's wedding was months ago, and the stillness between us has been so long that occasionally I forget what it was like to hear her speak. She has entirely cut off me. There are no books or calls, none. Some of me wants to keep reaching out. Another part, though, is afraid she won't reply. Not too long after the wedding, I would text her. I was still here, little notes just reminding her. Still her mum. She didn't reply, though. I just quit trying at last, even though every day. Hopefully this is the day she will contact. The course of life has been continuing. Sarah and Andy have been here marking me, trying to keep things normal even if it feels like there is a big hole in it now. Whatever it implies. Rachel is not particularly brought up anymore by them either. Like we are all acting as though she is on a protracted vacation. But every family function, every holiday, every birthday, that empty chair tells me that things change. I was sitting in the living room browsing pictures one afternoon when Sarah arrived carrying her phone with an odd expression on her face. She sat next to me, her expression almost unreadable, which made me uncomfortable. Since Sarah is not normally one to suppress her feelings, I sensed something was wrong. "Mother," she started, "you seemed like you might like to watch this." She handed me her phone and there it was, a post from Rachel's Instagram. She was standing with her hand on her tummy, a gentle grin on her face, and her husband, Dan, had his arm around her, staring down her like she was the most valuable thing in the world. Rachel was on her second pregnancy. I simply sat there gazing at the TV, not sure how to feel. She appeared to be delighted, genuinely pleased in a manner I hadn't seen in a long time, and still it ached. This was my daughter, my firstborn, and here she was starting this new chapter of her life without me. I would have missed everything: her wedding, her pregnancy, and now this baby. My grandson, I would never have ever seen. Given Sarah's hand on my face, she must have seen the expression. "Mum," she whispered gently, "I thought you should know. I wanted you not to learn from another person." I nodded and hardly could talk. "Thank you, Sarah." Trying to hide the grief building inside me, I faked a grin, but my chest tightened. Later that evening, when Mark returned home, I showed him the image. Though I anticipated some sort of response, he simply looked at it and nodded, saying something like, "Well, good for her." He seemed hardly as impacted as I was. He had gone on in a way I could not have. With him, Rachel chose to exclude us if she so desired. And he wasn't about to chase after her. But for me, it wasn't that straightforward. I couldn't just let go. In the days that followed, I found myself monitoring Rachel's social media obsessively. Every time she posted a new image, I'd analyze every aspect, seeking for hints about her life, wanting to feel connected to her in some little way. I knew it was sad, but it was all I had left. She was out there enjoying her life, and here I was, caught in this continual state of missing her. I chose to phone her one day. I reasoned perhaps she might like to discuss the baby. She might have allowed me back in, just perhaps. I called her at that number, my heart thumping, but it headed straight toward voicemail. I left a message, something basic like, "Hey honey, it's Mum. I wanted to say I'm thinking of you. When you get a moment, I would love to communicate." I noticed the photo. I don't know why I anticipated an answer. I checked my phone regularly for days later, waiting for a text or perhaps a missed call, but it never came. And ultimately I simply quit up, thinking she was really gone. A few weeks later, my younger daughter Mia sat me down. She'd been reading comments on Reddit about family circumstances similar to ours, where parents had lost touch with their kids, and she told me that maybe I needed to confront the truth. She wasn't nasty about it, but she was blunt. "Mom, maybe Rachel simply wants her own life apart from ours," she remarked. Perhaps it's time to welcome that. Stung, but I couldn't dispute it. Perhaps she was correct. Rachel could have moved on in a way I wasn't ready to welcome. So here I am, still trying to digest all of it. I keep thinking about the memories I have of Rachel growing up, the way she used to grin at me, the sound of her laughter. I recall the young child who used to take my hand, who used to gaze up at me with love and trust. It's like that girl's gone now, replaced by the stranger who doesn't want me in her life. Every day I tell myself I'm good, I can manage it. Actually, though, I'm not sure how to let go. I quote Mem, not sure how to quit dreaming she will come back. One day she will phone me and say she misses me, that she yearns for her mother to once more occupy her life. Time is said to cure everything, but I'm starting to think that's a lie. And now for the report from Opie's own daughter. "Hey everyone, I'm Mia, 17, Rachel's younger half-sister, and I felt it was time to set some things right. Rachel's pregnancy and everything have caused a lot of drama and conflict. That was a few months ago. And let me tell you, it has been a tornado of arguments, tears, and my mum into full denial. She simply doesn't understand, even though I did my best to encourage her to know she had crossed a limit. My mother continues to believe Rachel is overreacting, calling her unjust, and stating anybody else would agree with her even after hurting Rachel. Honestly, I thought, all right, let's test that notion. I've been lurking on Reddit for a while now and know how people can really lay into someone when they're incorrect. So I urged her to post about it here anonymously, simply to see if people would back her up. Spoiler alert, they didn't. I helped her write the piece, made sure she explained her side, even if she left out key things that would have made her appear worse. She even ventured that nobody would support her. Following the lies she turned on, it was wonderful to see her response to the remarks. She honestly thought people would support her as she had done nothing illegal. She went 3 hours reading the comments and answers. Grew more severe. She even suffered greatly and dropped down voted to nothingness. She was weeping and said people were being nasty and lacked understanding. My dad blamed me for posting our dirty laundry online when he arrived home and saw her crying. Mom insisted I remove the post, but I just uninstalled Reddit from her phone and kept it up as I thought everyone should know the whole truth. Having read all of your remarks, let me now explain a few points. From the sidelines, I am the watcher in this familial turmoil, and it is very crazy to see all the dynamics perform. The scoop is so here. First of all, based on what I know, my mother never chewed on my dad or anything. Some of you speculated that, but Mum and her ex-husband had a friendly divorce. Mum simply has an odd obsession about building the ideal family. Though that never occurred, she had always dreamt of twin girls. She so basically tried to shape Rachel and Sarah as twin daughters in her imagination. Although they are close in age, they were never as close as Mum would have had us believe. She had this whole vision of Rachel and Sarah living matched lives, doing everything together, and best friends. To be honest, Rachel and Sarah were just two average individuals who got along. They lacked the attachment at the hip that Mother intended. Mum urged them to be inseparable sisters, ignoring that truth. Mum's ideal was broken when Rachel lost it at Sarah about what had transpired with Nick. Rachel defied what Mum attempted to construct by not forgiving and forgetting. Not only a Disney family fantasy either. Mum has been striving to live up. She also wants to sweep things under the rug to show others how close we are, and believes family always remains together no matter what. Rachel, though, was finished engaging in that game. She wouldn't be ready to pardon a betrayal in order to bring Mother happiness. And, if I'm honest, that hit Mum more forcefully than she would ever acknowledge. And here is still another one. The relationship between Sarah and Nick is everything but flawless. You people were correct to assume that Mum's ideal of a flawless family is absolutely phony. Almost on the verge of divorce are Sarah and Nick. Not that my mother would know. She is too busy inhabiting her dream world. But Nick is hardly some saint. Let me say, Sarah forgiven him after he cheated on her at his own bachelor celebration with a stripper, stating it didn't count. I'm also really convinced Sarah hasn't been entirely devoted either. All of it is a mess. Mum still finds they are this perfect marriage, however, somehow. She finds it ridiculous that Sarah and Nick have had so many problems. Should she know the true narrative, her entire universe would most likely fall apart. To be honest, though, I doubt she wants to know. Let us now address Rachel's wedding. Mum and Dad had every intention of first, and we had reserved a motel close by. But several days before the wedding, my dad began to feel a little under the weather. It was only a little flu. Nothing very important. Mum twisted his non-bedridden state into a major drama, exaggerated his symptoms, and telling Rachel Dad was too sick for them to travel. Rachel naturally wasn't having it. She believed Mum was only making excuses since she knew it wasn't that severe. And to be honest, she was not mistaken. Mum sought a means to escape. Deep down, I believe she was offended that Rachel hadn't asked her to help with the wedding preparations, and that Dad and she weren't invited to the ceremony. She so chose to use Dad's sickness as a justification for skipping, which just infuriated Rachel. Rachel never even engaged in argument. When Mum phoned to call off she just advised not to waste turning up if that was how things were going to be. Mum acted hurt, but I knew it didn't actually trouble her. Rachel had initially left us out of mind by not including Mum into the wedding. It's only one more instance of how my mother's pride always gets in the way. Rachel then virtually stopped all communication with Mum and Dad. She missed holidays, didn't text or call. My personal Instagram was the only source of news about her. Still, even that felt far away. Sarah has even expressed desire to try for a kid, and I would guess Nick's going to go crazy when that occurs. He is just barely devoted as it is. It's like slow motion viewing a train disaster. I quote, "I'm not sure if Sarah is actually attempting to mend things or if she is only expecting that having a kid will miraculously address their issues. Still, good fortune with that. I'm sorry if I pulled you into this whole family issue to everyone reading this. However, I truly needed Mum to realise what she was doing. You all saw straight through it when she tried to twist the tale and depict herself as the victim. And I believe she required that wake-up call. Though I doubt she will change. At least now she is aware not everyone will purchase her side of things. And simply to clear things up." Exactly. First post came from my mother, bringing up all of me. Mia, the sister with the youngest age. I will attempt to respond to any inquiries anyone has. Sometimes mothers become so engrossed in their own worlds that they forget how their behaviour affects other people. Though it is distant from us, I just hope Rachel finds her happiness. She deserves her own fairy tale ending, not this chaotic drama Mother keeps dragging about. Regarding Sarah and Nick, they deserve each other, and honestly, I wish they stayed as unhappy as they look. It's almost funny to see them act as cheerful while their marriage is obviously on rocks. Although it's startling that they have survived this long, I doubt it will remain true much longer. That serves as the current reality check.